How does React update the real DOM, the DOM in the browser, I mean with that? The render method being called does not immediately also render this to the real DOM. The name can be misleading. This does not mean that it renders it to the DOM. Render is more a suggestion of what the HTML should look like in the end. But render can very well be called and lead to the same result as is already displayed. And that is part of the reason why we use should_component_update to prevent unnecessary render calls. But even if we don't catch an unnecessary render call, maybe a prop did change and still we would render the same result for whatever reason. Even then, this does not mean that it immediately hits the real DOM and starts re-rendering it. Instead, it first of all does something else. It compares virtual DOMs. It has an old virtual DOM and a re-rendered or future virtual DOM. React takes this virtual DOM approach because it's faster than the real DOM. Now, a virtual DOM simply is a DOM representation in JavaScript. You can of course represent all HTML and therefore DOM elements and objects in pure JavaScript, so without rendering anything to the browser. And this is what happens here. And React basically keeps two copies of the DOM. It has the old virtual DOM and then the re-rendered one. The re-rendered one is the one which gets created when the render method is called. Now, as I mentioned though, re-rendering or calling render doesn't immediately update the real DOM. Instead, React makes a comparison. It compares the old virtual DOM to the new one and it checks if there are any differences. If it can detect differences, it reaches out to the real DOM and updates it. And even then, it doesn't re-render the real DOM entirely. It only changes it in the places where differences were detected. For example, if a button text changed, it will only update that text and not re-render the whole button, leave alone the whole DOM. If no differences were found, then it doesn't touch the real DOM. Render did execute, the comparison was made, and that is why should_component_update might make sense to prevent this if it's not needed, because this of course already also costs some resources. But nonetheless, the real DOM is never touched. You can't rely on that. The real DOM will only be touched if there are real differences. And this of course is important, because as you might know, accessing the DOM is really slow. This is something you want to do as little as possible. And hence, React has this virtual DOM idea, compares the virtual DOMs, and makes sure that the real DOM is only touched if needed. This is what happens behind the scenes. And this is what we can see in our application too. Back in this application, we of course have all our checks in place now with should_component_update. But what we can still see is that if we inspect anything here, and if we click toggle persons, clearly these divs were added, you saw them flash. But if you watch closely the button and the cockpit div, if I click here, this never flashes because it's not re-rendered. This is what I meant. It doesn't really change. Yeah, the button styling changed, but the part above the button, like this paragraph here, you see the class of the button changed, but the paragraph and the h1 tag on the right, these never flash because they never changed. So they aren't re-rendered, they aren't touched by React at all. This is what I mean. The render method for the cockpit was executed. Otherwise, the button class wouldn't be updated. But still, this didn't re-render everything. It did do so in the future virtual DOM, but it didn't do so in the actual DOM because React compared the future virtual DOM to the old one and only touched the real DOM in the places where differences were found.